I'm a nice guy. I try not to judge people on first impressions, and for the most part, I like to think I've always been that way. There have only been a few exceptions to this rule. Mostly the random gibbering homeless people or ranting religious zealots, people you pass on the way to work and don't really want to get involved with. The one I remember most often, however, was Jeffrey Jones. I went to school with Jeff. Somewhat. I don't want to get ahead of myself here, but it'd be more appropriate to say I spent about 1 year of school with him. We were both freshmen at a stale white and blue high school that seemed more like a prison or a factory than a place of education. Jeff was fucking weird. Not in the same way as someone who's way too smart or way too stupid, or a boy who's really into drama class. He was legitimately strange as a human being. Off. Wrong. He was tall and lanky, almost as tall as his brother Louis, who was 2 years ahead of him. I guess you could call him goth or emo or whatever the term is. I was never into ironically conformist subcultures, but I'd label him that way due to the stringy black hair and the one shaved side of his head, and the fact that he didn't seem to own any clothes in colors other than black. Jeff barked at someone. Legitimately barked. Like a dog. Some kid gave him shit for his whole My Chemical Romance thing, and Jeff did his best Cujo impression right in the guy's face. It wasn't just like a momentary scare tactic, like he drew a blank on how to handle the situation. Jeff barked loud and long. He didn't stop until the other kid turned and walked away, with Jeff barking at his back like a lunatic. There are plenty of examples I can still recall at this point. One time we were given an assignment to write an essay about a historical duo. The problem wasn't that Jeff picked more recent figures. The problem was that he selected Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold. Someone must have told the teacher what was up because she never called on him to present his essay in front of the class. That was the end of it. Most telling was Jeff's notebook. He left it behind in class once, and someone decided to go through it. From what I heard, it was full of bad drawings of demons and terribly written fanfiction where Jeff teams up with movie villains. He envisioned himself as a badass martial artist who earned the fear and respect of monsters and hardened killers. Instead of treating it as yet another red flag, kids were content to use it as a source of mockery. I guess the real roadblock, though, was Louis Jones. Jeff's older brother was a pretty proficient player for our basketball team, the Haymakers. It was named long ago by a farming community who didn't consider the secondary definition of the word. Students wanted to stay on the good side of Louis and his clique. Teachers knew that the majority of the school's budget actually came from sporting events. Local authorities, well, the information would never make its way up to them, so I guess they can't be to blame. Jeff could pretty much do anything he wanted, short of murder, and he knew there'd be no real repercussions. Punishing Jeff would be a distraction for Louis. We couldn't have that, could we? I wasn't exactly an angel, of course. I mean, as much as I tried to give people the benefit of the doubt, Jeff really strained my patience. Girls would cross the hallway to avoid him. Not because he would accost or annoy them, but because he would leer at them. That alone seemed more distressing to female students than the awkward, hormone-fueled antics of other boys. It's difficult to explain. It was a look that almost seemed to say, "You know, if I did it, no one would listen to you." I don't know what caused this behavior. I have no idea what kind of home life Jeff and Louis had, but it was obvious their parents were remarried. Louis reminded me of a younger, more lithe Shaquille O'Neal, while Jeff was more of a Rob Schneider. Someone you wouldn't be afraid of, or even give a second look, if not for the overt attempts at looking and being edgy. Eventually, a couple of friends and I decided to take Jeff aside and talk to him. It was a huge mistake, and while we knew it would probably be fruitless, we were high on teenage melodrama and saw ourselves as protectors of the student body, maybe even saviors of Jeff himself if we could get through to him. "Hey, Jeff," I called out after lunch, drawing his attention before he went back into the building. He was always the last one back. You know, fashionably late, I guess. "You need to stop messing with everyone," my friend Troy chimed in as Jeff stood toe-to-toe with me, arms folded. "I don't mess with people," Jeff whispered in a put-on gravelly voice. "People mess with me." Keith, the third in our ill-advised musketeers, chuckled. Jeff instantly turned to him, cocking his head to the side and cupping one ear with his hand, as if he hadn't clearly heard the laughter. "What's funny?" Jeff snarled. "Do I look like a joke to you? Do you not recognize darkness incarnate when it stands before you?" "What's wrong with you, man?" Troy drew Jeff's attention back off of Keith, who was visibly shaken and clearly falling for the paper-thin tough guy act. "Are you, literally crazy, or do you just like scaring everyone all the time?" It was a clumsy comeback, but it fulfilled its purpose in the moment. I'm not blameless for what happened. Not at all. I don't want this to seem like I'm stacking the deck against Jeff here. He was obnoxious, threatening, and probably violent when no one was watching. However, that doesn't excuse how we reacted when he made the hot-headed mistake of shoving Troy to the ground. Keith and I were frozen for a moment. It was an instant. Jeff was in Troy's face. The next second, Troy was on his ass, and Jeff was barking at him. If we weren't so shocked by the sudden turn from argument to assault, we might have been able to collect our thoughts. We could have helped Troy to his feet, made a useless report to the principal, and went on living our lives. That's not what we did. I was the first one on top of Jeff. I tackled him to the ground, hard, as if he had killed Troy instead of shoving him off balance. I think he was screaming as I punched him repeatedly in the side of his head, the shaved side. Keith was with me in a flash, kicking Jeff in the leg and hip. I didn't even know Keith was doing it at the time, in the rush of adrenaline. Before long, Troy was back on his feet, and, apparently feeling he should join in since he was the one who had been shoved, he delivered a single stomp at Jeff's chest, crushing the breath out of him. The fight, or I guess the attack, lasted for mere seconds. It was a brief display, showing Jeff that he might be able to fuck with the other 100+ kids at the school, but not us. Never us. We felt like we were the only ones who put morality over popularity. Ironic, I know. The funny thing about that day, if you can call any of it funny, is that we never got in trouble. Jeff didn't tell a soul. It's almost like the influence his brother had over the school went both ways. Maybe Jeff didn't want Lewis coming back at us and risking his future. Maybe he was just embarrassed to admit that darkness incarnate was left wheezing and crying in the school's courtyard. I guess I'll never really figure it out. The upside of the whole thing was that Jeff was an absolute angel for the next couple of months. No leering at girls, no taking things that didn't belong to him, no barking. The gossip at the time was that Jeff was finally warned by faculty, but Troy, Keith, and I knew the real reason. The next big controversy was a shakeup in the yearbook department. A couple of kids running it got caught giving students unflattering placeholder names. Slutty Sarah, Nick the Nerd, Fat Ass Felix, stuff like that. They were reprimanded harshly, and it seemed like that was going to take root as the year's big scandal. Everything seemed to be normal as Halloween festivities approached. This was early in our sophomore year, and nobody really paid attention to Jeff anymore. Lewis was free to be the head of Respectful Costume Day without being tacitly connected to his brother's antics. And yes, in case you would ask, it used to be Costume Day until a mariachi band arrived a couple years prior. I'll give you 3 guesses as to who Jeff dressed as that year. If all 3 of your guesses weren't Heath Ledger's Joker, then I failed to accurately explain this guy's personality and behavior. Of course, it would be a crude attempt at mimicking the deceased actor's psychotic tour de force. Now, when I say he came to school dressed as the Joker, I don't mean exactly. For the most part, his clothes were the same as usual. Black ripped jeans, black boots with elevated soles, black shirt, with the addition of a black trench coat, black and white face paint, and red lips. His everyday outlandishness almost seemed to make sense. Almost. I was talking with Jane, my girlfriend at the time, when we both fell silent just to watch Jeff skitter past. She was dressed as Jessie from Toy Story, and even tipped her hat to Jeff as he stopped briefly to flash us an unbalanced grin. I didn't notice the made-up scars on his cheeks until that very moment, but at least he wasn't giving her the look again. For some reason, seeing Jeff like that caused me more shame than anything else. I was Heathcliff the cat. It was an old sweater and orange pants my mother had striped a while back, and it still seemed to fit pretty well, so it seemed like an obvious choice. Jane thought I was a tiger, so I went with that. For the rest of the day, all I thought about was whether it was okay to find Jessie sexually attractive or not. It was one of those school days that's just a waste due to the spectacle of it all. You can't take a report on World War II seriously when it comes out of the mouth of a bad Tony Stark impersonator. Then, the fire alarm rang. Everyone in the classroom laughed immediately. We had been waiting for some sort of prank or unscheduled event in the lead up to Halloween. Still, the teacher got us up and out of the door in a regimented line. Dracula behind the Green Ranger, behind Gomez Adams, behind a zombie cheerleader. It was hilarious. It wasn't until we were in the hallway that we heard the screaming. It wasn't prank screaming, not one of those lame Halloween sound effect CDs. It was real, bone-chilling shrieking from multiple people. Many people. The teacher told us to continue to the exit as her high heels click-clacked into a jog down the hall and around the corner. We were all silent. Other students from other classes had joined us now, and the only thing that we weren't doing was walking to any exits. The screaming continued, the sound of a window breaking like someone had fallen or jumped through it. Anything else was drowned out by the ding of the fire alarm. "Someone should go see what's up," suggested a disembodied voice. "We gotta go outside. The firemen will help them. We can't," said another. "Fuck this. Fuck it, man," a third helpfully added. Some kids broke free from the group and wanted to leave the building. Others stayed right there on the spot, ready to run once they saw exactly what was going on. I, in one of my trademark bouts of unbridled altruistic stupidity, decided to make my way towards the panic. As I left the others behind and rounded the corner, I saw what the source of the commotion was. Jeffrey Jones. He stood to one side of the body-strewn hallway, his head angled away from me and towards the teacher who had just ordered us to safety moments before. She crawled, face down, on the waxed faux marble floor, blood trailing after her. I could see the glint of the knife still wedged in her back, between the vertebrae. I let out a scream immediately. There was no time to stifle it. Upon hearing the noise, Jeff turned to me. I'll never know how he singled it out of the echoing cries already filling the building. Jeff had added some accessories to his costume, among them a feather boa from a heavyset girl I had seen dressed as Lady Gaga, a loose necktie I recognized from a senior dressed as his own dad, and a distressingly familiar cowgirl hat. The makeup on his face had all but vanished due to the sweat. In the moment, even from that distance, I realized that the cuts on his cheeks weren't actually prosthetics. They were real, They were as real as the viscous blood on his hands, arms, chest, and legs. Jeff started to walk towards me. My first instinct was to run. I would have done that if not for the injured girl that saw this as her opportunity to escape. As soon as she stumbled to her feet, steadying herself on a locker, Jeff reached beneath the bag of the nearby trash can and pulled out another knife with masking tape still stuck to its blade. Within an instant, he had her throat cut for a second time. And this one stuck. I was already running towards the girl by the time he grabbed her and then dropped her to the floor. I don't know if I yelled at him to stop or if I let out a primal noise. All I know is that I retrieved the fire extinguisher from the wall, and I hadn't even considered the fact that I was about to attempt to bash in the head of another human being. Seeing me coming from a mile away, or maybe just hearing my less than stealthy approach, Jeff reached above a locker and retrieved yet another taped-down butcher's knife. He must have been hiding them around the school for weeks. It's insane to think no one randomly found them. So that it was. Dual-wielding kitchen cutlery versus a crude red metal bludgeon. It would be an inelegant, cumbersome, and messy display that would most likely leave both of us slowly dying in a detestable heap. Fortunately for me, that was the moment Lewis finally stepped in and attempted to handle the train wreck his brother had become. I didn't even see where he came from. My tunnel vision blackened all the way to the menacing figure that had been casually strolling my way. "Jeff," Lewis's voice boomed. "What the fuck are you doing?" I stopped. Jeff stopped. The world stopped. "Rapture," Jeff replied coolly. "Judgment Day." "I don't understand," Lewis all but cried out, his face twisted up into a knot of emotional torture. With thick arms wide open, he slowly approached Jeff, who refused to look back at him. "I'm judging the sheep for their sins, their stupidity," Jeff offered back. Lewis finally reached his brother's side, taking a cautious stance. He took Jeff's hand and removed the knife with no real resistance. The blade clattered on the floor. "And sheep," Jeff continued, finally looking his brother in the face with a blank, loveless expression, "are only good for slaughter." Lewis had approached Jeff from the side. It only took a moment for my mind to register a crucial mistake. He hadn't seen Jeff's other hand. "There's a knife!" I shouted. Instead of looking at Jeff's hand or backing away, Lewis turned his attention to me as if he had no idea what I was talking about. It was the only option I never would have accounted for. With one single fluid motion, Jeff planted the knife into Lewis's neck, releasing a shower of crimson-tinged profanities from a sports deity suddenly made frighteningly mortal. "Shh," Jeff sneered as Lewis leaned against him, sliding to the floor. "It'll be over soon. It's just like going to sleep. Shh." There would be no more interaction on my part. No more standing around like a fear-gripped child who was waiting for any excuse to avoid what he had to do. What had to be done. I was raining down steel blows on Jeff's head before he even realized I was after him again. He crumbled to the floor, but I didn't stop. This wasn't like the courtyard after lunch. This wasn't an overreaction. And I was more sure of myself at that moment than any time before or since. Jeff had to die, and I was the only one who had to save the world from his continued existence. I broke several fingers while trying to use the fire extinguisher for unintended purposes. One when I got it caught between the handle, and the others were presumably pinned between the metal and Jeff's skull. Most of the details are still shrouded in a haze of panicked fury. The numbness wore off quickly, giving way to stinging pain. I could no longer keep a solid grip of the weapon, and trying to wipe my own blood from the orange and black sweater I wore only covered my hands in more blood than had splattered there. Jeff dragged himself slowly, trembling fingertips pressed against the slick floor. I could only fall into a sitting position and watch, panting, as he made a slug trail of gore towards the bench. I knew what would be there. Another blade, taped to the underside of the seat. I didn't care. He'd have to be dead soon. Maybe I would be too. I couldn't even hear the fire alarm anymore, and I considered maybe I was having an eerily calm heart attack or stroke. Before Jeff could reach the bench, a strong fist grasped at his pants leg. Lewis. Jeff's hands scrambled to regain traction as his brother slowly, painfully pulled him back towards him. The two lay there as Lewis held Jeff's faltering body in a tight embrace. I knew the bear hug wasn't out of love. It was simply the only way to keep him still. Later, I found out that Keith and Troy had been amongst the first kids to actually evacuate the building when the alarm rang. No one outside knew what was going on, and the police were on the scene quickly, but not quick enough. Jane was dead. So were over a dozen other students and staff. So was Lewis. So was Jeff. I found his parents beaten to death with an aluminum bat. His house was trashed. We didn't go back to school for an inordinately long period of time until the board figured out where to send everybody. I didn't see Keith again, and only saw Troy in passing since our schedules were entirely different at the new location. The only sense of normalcy after this incident came was when our yearbooks arrived. Since most of the students spent years together at that school and the events surrounding the school year's termination were highly unusual, people requested the yearbooks still be sent out as a much-deserved keepsake. The well-intentioned idea was to remember the good rather than the bad, and memorialize the victims. There was a bit of an argument about funding, but in the end, families and concerned citizens successfully shouted down the school board. When I cracked open that book, a bittersweet reverence fell over me. There was Jane. There was Lewis, complete with quotes beneath their pictures, ones their parents thought they would have picked. The yearbooks were recalled right away. We didn't get new ones. I don't know who did it, or why. Just another sick joke from a random chuckle fuck on the yearbook committee, I guess. But there it was, staring back at me from the page. Jeffrey Jones, amateurishly photoshopped into a white-faced, red-lipped mockery of himself. Name: Jeff the Killer. Quote: "Go to sleep.